Call the meeting to order of the Clatsop County Planning Commission for September 13th, 2022. We'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. Right. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which one nation, indivisible. We may have a roll call.
Jason Kraschauer. He appears to be online. Christopher Farrar.
Present.
Mike Magyar.
Present.
Katie Pritchard.
Present by video.
Terry Johnson.
Here.
Jeremy Linder.
Here.
Clark Powers.
Here.
Gail Henriksen. Here. Thank you.
Before we adopt the agenda, I was going to suggest that as a matter of practice, we add to the end of the agenda, just before adjourn, a good of the order. Maybe that's inferred, but gives a chance for any commissioner to make a brief comment or a suggestion of something to consider in the future. So with that minor change, do we have consensus to adopt the agenda as amended briefly?
Consensus.
All right. The agenda is accepted with the addition of a good to the order at the end. And this is now a time to open the meeting for public comment. For anybody wishing to give a comment on any item that's not on the agenda, this is a time you can step forward and have about 3 minutes to comment on any issue that you wish to. Please provide your name and address for the record. Are there any members of the public wishing to make a comment at this time? I see none. Were there any written comments submitted? Yeah. Not? Okay, moving on then, we have a public hearing today on the County Commission's bylaws, and this isn't like one of our typical public hearings where we take a lot of testimony and things like that. It's a little unusual because it's more a matter of just setting up some rules and practices that this commission follows, and it's primarily just approved by the Board of Commissioners. And we've reviewed this quite a bit, but I'll still ask if the staff wants to kind of introduce the topic again and bring everybody up to speed on exactly what we're doing here today.
Yes, thank you, Chair. For the record, I'm Gail Henriksen, Community Development Director. The Planning Commission has been discussing some revisions to the bylaws since June of last year. The last time we did an update to the bylaws was in 2018. And so we've made several revisions over the past year and a half or so. The latest ones occurred after your August 3rd joint work session with the Board of Commissioners. And based on comments and discussion at that joint work session, we made 3 additional changes to the bylaw draft that you see in front of you today. The first one was to add language regarding training and mandatory trainings for the Planning Commission. You'll find that in Article 4, subsection D, number 5 and 6. We also added language clarifying that you as the Planning Commission will act as the Committee for Citizen Involvement for Land Use Planning, and we added the word land use to make that clear. That's to be found in Article 2, subsection A4. And then finally, the third revision that we did for today's meeting was to clarify the scope of the Planning Commission's work. We added in that you're also responsible for review of subdivisions, code amendments, and zoning and comprehensive plan amendments. And that language is also in Article 2, it's subsection A2. And so what we're asking today is for a formal recommendation from the Planning Commission on these revised bylaws, and then we would take them to the Board of Commissioners for review and approval on September 28th. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for that report. Are there any questions from any of the commissioners? I had just a couple of points. One I brought up in the past a couple of times, and it can't be resolved through the bylaws alone, but I do feel that removing the review of the Planning Commission for conditional use permits is not in the best interest of involving the public in land use decision-making, and that it was better when conditional use permits did come before this commission instead of directly to a hearings officer. That's just a view I have, and I realize that would need to be changed in the law doc codes, and that's something that I think would be appropriate to think about doing in the future. But that's one comment. I did have a question about the implementation of one feature in the bylaws, and again, I don't think we can settle it here today, but it's maybe you can clarify this. When the board decides that in the interest of facilitating having a best available planning commission, they can circumvent the 10-year limitation on the amount of time served, but it doesn't explain what procedure is used. Would that be that the person whose term was due to expire but was desired to be kept on would file an application, and there would be a competitive application process, or would it just be by the decision of the Board of Commissioners to make that appointment directly without an application process and public chance to hear the options?
So ultimately, the board would have to appoint someone, whether we did a call for applicants and put an advertisement out there. We do accept applications at all times, and we keep them on file for 2 years. As staff, our typical procedure would be to do a call for submissions, but the board could certainly direct us and say, no, we only want this one applicant. I don't know why they would choose to do that, but I'm not aware of anything that would prevent them from doing that.
Thanks for that clarification. I think everybody's had a chance to read the packet. We're looking for a motion here to send this on to the Board of Commissioners. So if somebody would like to make that motion, there's potential language there on pages 6 and 7.
Make that motion. That I recommend that the Board of Commissioners approve the revised Planning Commission bylaws as amended.
It's been moved by Commissioner Johnson that we recommend to the Board of Commissioners to approve the revised Planning Commission bylaws as amended, or as presented, actually.
As presented, the amendments have already been made, so.
Correct.
And
Is there a second?
I'll second that motion.
Been moved and seconded then to recommend to the Board of Commissioners to approve the revised Planning Commission bylaws as presented. All those in favor signify with aye. Those opposed, no.
Aye.
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 Or should we do that by roll call?
Jason just said aye. I didn't hear anything from Katie.
Let's do a
Aye.
roll call vote.
Katie said aye. Everyone said aye.
Okay. Unanimously approved then. We have, the rest of the meeting, most of the rest of the meeting is dedicated to a work session, and work sessions are a time for the commissioners to work with the staff and, any invited parties to take up a particular issue and discuss it freely. It's not typically a time that we take any public comment, so, we will begin the work session today on, the geologic hazards overlay, and if we could have a staff report, that would be good. Is that Mr. Sisson?
Thank you.
Senior Planner Assistant.
Thank you, Chair Farrar. Good morning, Planning Commissioners. I'm Ian Sisson, Senior Planner, and today we have a work session on some proposed updates to our geologic hazards overlay. So we currently regulate development activities in identified geologic hazard areas. We have an overlay map, which hopefully all of you have seen before. And so if a property is within an identified hazard area, we require a special permit, a geologic hazard permit, prior to any site preparation, land disturbing activities, or construction. And part of that permit application process involves having the applicant obtain a report from a qualified licensed professional, which is either a registered geologist or a certified engineering geologist. And there are standards for what needs to be included in that report, and how it's organized. And essentially, those reports are composed of an analysis of the hazards present on that specific property and recommendations specific to the proposed development as far as how construction activities and land disturbing activities and site preparation and things should be carried out. So when we receive an application for one of those permits, we check that the report was prepared by a qualified licensed professional per our code. We review that report and we pull out the conclusions and the recommendations, and those effectively become conditions of approval for that development project. And then, they would continue through sort of the normal permitting process after that part is complete, getting whatever other development and building permits might be required for that project. So the purpose of this proposed code update is to update our code language. We want to make sure that our criteria and our procedures are consistent with peer jurisdictions, best management practices, industry standards. You have in your packet today a quick summary of a report that was published by DOGAMI, the State Department of Mineral and Geological Industries. I think I said that correctly, Geological and Mineral Industries. And so DOGAMI put together a guide for communities to update their codes, to strengthen their codes, to make sure that their practices are consistent with DOGAMI's recommendations. So we want to look at our code language and update that as needed, then update our mapping to use the best available data to determine the types and locations of geologic hazards. Our current geohazard overlay map is largely based on DOGAMI data from 1974 and 79. There were a couple of bulletins that DOGAMI published back then. And so we want to incorporate new information where we can. And finally, we want to understand and address concerns of the public and gather input from property owners, residents, builders, developers, and geohazard professionals. And so a quick summary of our current code, that is found in Law Duc section 5.3000, and the intent is essentially to minimize building hazards and threats to life and property that may be created by various identified geologic hazards, including landslides, coastal erosion, weak foundation soils, and basing our decisions, again, on actions by qualified professionals. So we have areas subject to mass wasting, essentially landslides. We refer to a few different studies, including those DOGAMI 74 and 79 bulletins. And then in the southwest coastal area, we have a Martin Ross report as well. The geohazard overlay also applies to all oceanfront lots and the beach and dune hazard area. And then we also have mapping for compressible soils. So I mentioned our permit requirements before. Those are found in the law duck, and again, essentially require that a person obtain a geotechnical report and apply for a geologic hazard permit before doing any site development. And then we also have a waiver option, and so waivers are available when a qualified professional finds that the identified hazard does not actually exist on the property, or at least in the area where land disturbing activities or development is proposed. And so in that case, the applicant would submit, it's usually a paragraph or two in a letter format from the licensed professional that says how they determined that there was no hazard present on the site. In that case, we can grant a waiver to the requirement for a full report. And so sources of information for this update, we referred to the Dogami guide that I mentioned. Again, in your packet, there is a quick 4-page summary of that report, and then linked in the packet was this full document, which was quite a bit longer and more detailed. Tillamook County zoning ordinance. Tillamook County recently adopted an overhaul to their geohazard code, and so we referred to that. And then 2 state agencies, DLCD and Dogami, have also been involved with some of their staff. Meg Reed, coastal shore specialist for DLCD, and Bill Burns is an engineering geologist for Dogami, and so they have been assisting with helping to find the best information that's available and providing data sources. So in your packet, there is 2 versions of the proposed code updates. There's a clean format and a strike-through format. Essentially, the changes that we are proposing at this point are to update the applicability section to replace outdated data sources, and then to revise our map in accordance with those new sources, to provide for exemptions from geohazard permit requirements for certain types of lower risk development activities. This is not something we currently have in the code. So this would be a new opportunity, you know, again, for minimal things like small excavations or small amounts of fill, to be exempt from the requirement for a geohazard permit. And then aligning our geotechnical report standards with some state guidelines that were published by the State Board of Geologist Examiners. And then to extend the period our geotechnical reports are considered valid. Currently, when someone turns in a geohazard application, the attached report is only considered valid permitting procedures for 2 years from the date the report was published. And so we would be looking at extending that to 5. A couple of other things that we have put in the proposed updates for consideration. These come from the Dogami landslide guide, landslide planning guide, as well as the Tillamook County code. These were implemented. One is a certification of compliance, and so this would kind of strengthen the follow-up on making sure that development plans, construction documents, and actual on-the-ground construction throughout a project are done in compliance with the report and the recommendations and the permit conditions. Building Codes Division currently receives copies of those reports and those permits and the conditions, and is aware of those conditions and makes sure that they're implemented. What this would add is that the licensed professional that prepared the report, or an alternative qualified licensed professional, would supervise the construction process. So there would be review of the building plans and then review of the actual construction to make sure and to certify that everything has been carried out appropriately in conjunction with that report. And then the other item would be a hazard disclosure statement, and so this would be for any property that was subject to a geologic hazard permit from the time these code updates were adopted. If this is included, the hazard disclosure statement would be a recorded document that would state that the property is subject to potential natural hazards, that there is a geologic hazard report on file with our department, that the owner accepts the risks of damages from natural hazards and associated with development of the property, and that the owner won't interfere with any hazard mitigation measures on the property and will maintain. Just another measure to protect, especially where properties are transferred, so that new property owners or prospective buyers are aware of those hazards and also aware of certain things that they might not be able to see, you know, for example, foundation underpinning that they wouldn't necessarily know is there. Aware that those are there and to maintain them in good working order. So we ran a survey questionnaire for the public from August 5th to September 5th and advertised that in various outlets. We also sent that to anyone who has applied for a geohazard permit within the last 3 years, including the professionals who prepared the reports that came in with those permits. And we collected 135 responses. Some of the top concerns as far as hazards in the county were seismic hazards, coastal erosion, and landslides. So I'll briefly go through a quick summary of the results. And we had mostly people from cities respond. We did have about a third of respondents that live in unincorporated Clatsop County, which is where this code would apply. Most of our respondents were homeowners. And then we had a mix of developers and builders and geoprofessionals as well. So many people did live on property that was within an identified geologic hazard. Many did not. About half of the respondents were not currently familiar with our code, and about half were either at least somewhat familiar or very familiar with the code. Most of the respondents had not ever been required to obtain a geohazard permit from our office. In this question, we asked whether we should allow for exemptions for certain development activities in geohazard areas, and surprisingly, we got a large number of people that said no. I would say anecdotally, as planning staff, we frequently hear that people are interested in exemptions for certain activities, for example, building a deck or building a shed or replacing an existing deck or replacing an existing structure or making a small addition to an existing structure. Those kinds of things, when we're at the counter or on the phone speaking with people from the public, builders, developers, homeowners, we pretty regularly hear, oh, really, I have to get a geohazard permit for that? And so I was surprised to see the number of responses that we got against that. One thing that we considered with this question was listing potential activities that could be exempt, but we didn't want to create a leading question and just have everyone agree with the things that we suggested. So potentially in the future, if we wanted to collect more information on this, you know, now that we have a first draft of the code update, we could present the proposed exemption list and get. There was generally support for requiring the certification of compliance, and there was also generally support for requiring the hazard disclosure statement. And then just a quick project overview. We have our work session with the Planning Commission today. We have a work session with the Board of Commissioners next month. The goal here is to collect feedback on the first draft so that we can make revisions as appropriate. And then we will come back to you in November for a public hearing and ask for your recommendation to the Board of Commissioners. And if we get that recommendation from you, we would take the document to the board in December for the first hearing, and then in January of next year for the second hearing. So I have a list of questions for you, but before we get to those, I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about the presentation.
Member of the commission have a question for your planner?
Yeah, I have one. There is one line here in this document,
So,
somewhere else. I was looking for the overlay. I'm in it, and, but I don't know where to go. How would someone find it?
the best way would be to go to Clatsop County Web Maps.
That be put into here so people know where?
We could add a note in there of where to find the map, yes.
Might be only online, so on how to. A lot of people don't, not comfortable. Going to be the basis discussion here. Good idea to try to put something like how do you use web maps? And then once you know how, right, this is.
Thank you. That would be pretty easy for us to do too. With this questionnaire that we put out, when we asked the question of whether the respondent lived or owned property in an identified geohazard area, we had a link that said, not sure, here's how to find out, with a set of instructions for how to go onto web maps and how to turn on the geohazard overlay. So we've already got it, and that would be really easy for us to implement.
Okay, I have a few questions and comments. You can wait till I get through this list before you respond.
Sure.
But, I want to know what is the minimum required by the state that we have implemented as a county as far as the geohazard permit? One of the problems that I've seen, I've applied for and obtained several geohazard permits. We don't have, available qualified individuals get one of these reports done in a reasonable amount of time. You have to go out of town. Also, I think we do need to figure out a list of things that would be exempted, such as building a deck on your house or putting a or what those would be, because some of these simple projects shouldn't have to require a permit that requires notifying all the neighbors and going through the whole process. If you're just all to your property, that really isn't going to be anybody other than yourself.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but it might be easier if we gave, planning staff a chance. Otherwise, it's gonna be hard to follow, so I don't know if,
I don't have too many other comments.
well, on those two, though, I don't know if, senior planner Sisson would like to address those, or perhaps, director.
So as far as any state requirements, you know, that we require locally, that we require local permits for development in geohazard areas, I'm not aware of any requirement by the state that says we do that.
Is the geohazard permit in itself a requirement? We have something in place. Whatever. whatever we do is just, we're doing this as a county because we've decided that this is what we need to do.
We are required to meet goal 7, which is the natural hazard statewide planning goal. And so, you know, we have our comprehensive plan, which implements the statewide planning goal. And, we have policies in our goal 7, related to geologic hazards and how to regulate development in identified geologic hazards areas. And so what our geologic hazards overlay does is implements our countywide goal 7 and effectively the statewide planning goals. Yes, in some respects, it is required to meet goal 7, right?
Okay. So another issue that I've ran across is that the maps are terrible. I've seen where you have a flat field somewhere in a geohazard zone. It's on the map, so you have a requirement in place that you have to hire a professional, at least to get a waiver. And even that, to find a professional that can come out, look at the property, and then provide you with a letter or certification that it shouldn't be in the zone is a problem. Not that you can just get someone to come out overnight and do that. So that's a concern. And did I see something that all oceanfront lots require?
That's correct. That's not new.
Okay. So I think in some ways that this is an improvement on what we had, but I think we could requiring a permit, maybe some of the notification things that take time. You have to notify neighboring properties.
One thing on
Maybe
that,
loosening up the standards on who a certified professional might, or even given the county some authority where if a county staff comes out and folks don't exceed a percentage, then okay. So there's just a few ideas.
so on the application procedure, one thing I wanted to clarify, that we've already implemented actually is that we're processing these applications as a type 1 procedure, and it's an $85, similar to a development permit fee. So up until July of this year, we were, processing geohazard permit applications as a type 2, and the application fee was $440, required a 10-day public comment period, notice to surrounding property owners, 12-day appeal period. So we've already reduced that to actually align with our code. And it's a type 1 procedure and $85 fee, no public notice.
I think I've been through it as a type 2 procedure. Right, so that's an improvement.
So just to run on a tangent on one of Carrie's comments about maybe finding just anybody to address these, I don't know who carries more liability than a geotechnical person. I mean, these guys are like, they got the gun right to the temple. If something slips or slides, they're really kind of on the hook. I don't know if we want to give the average citizen that kind of exposure, even if just to make it fast. I mean, I get it. I get what you're saying. You know, people ask me almost once a week, do you know a geotech in town who can help? And I'm like, I know a guy, but I don't think your project is worth his while. And that's a huge problem. And what do we do about that?
Well, one way to address it is potentially having that hazard disclosure statement and have it being attached to the deed where someone knows that their property, falls in a geohazard overlay zone. Some risk, living there, buying a home there.
Well, what do you think the real estate agents are going to say about additional risk statements? I don't think they're going to be pretty happy about it. And they got a lobby that'll make sure that gets squashed.
Okay.
That's just my take. I'm not saying it's not a good idea. I'm 100% behind full disclosure if we could get it to happen. I don't see how we could even take that on, but I like that.
Does any one of the other commissioners wish to comment on these particular?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hey,
Go ahead.
this is Commissioner Kraushaar. I agree with Commissioner Johnson. You know, I've been through this before on a few different projects. I agree that we need some sort of exemption list. I think that we all agree across the board, whatever that is, we can put our heads together and come up with some exemptions. I agree the maps are not correct. We've been through this with certain things. We've got areas that are designated wetlands or floodplains, and they're not. I mean, the maps, they're wrong. And then there's a process that you have to go through to prove that they're wrong, which is costly, and all the reports that we have to do. But it also says it in I think it's page 6 of 11, page 41 in our report, section 5.3030, independent review. It says that if the applicant goes through this expense to have a geotech and do everything that they're supposed to do, if the director at his, which should be changed to their discretion, they can request that another report be done by an expert of their choosing. So now we're going to prolong a process because they don't like the report that was filed by a geotech. Now they're going to choose their own geotech and make the applicant pay for it. I think that we need to clean up some of these processes, and I mean, if they're going to go through the report or the process of having a geotech do this report and the expense, I think that report, along with and I can't see who's talking. The Zoom meeting is not working really well today, but someone said that the geotech, you know, they have all the liability in the world, and I agree with that. If they're going to do a report, we shouldn't just throw their report out. Those are
Okay, I want to just follow up on that one point, get a clarification from staff. I understood that we're eliminating that part of the code regarding getting a second opinion kind of thing, and instead going with the certification process.
it's still in the strike
Sure,
through.
I'll bring the proposal up on screen. So I think the section Commissioner Kraushaar was referring to is 5.3030, independent review. This is a carryover from our existing code, and I don't believe here, I'll go to the strike-through version, but I don't think we made any changes to that section.
I'm looking at the strike through, and I don't see anything. Like I said, for some reason, we can't see your screen, so.
Your sound kind of broke up there. I don't know if you say something to make sure we can hear you.
Let me try that again here.
Can I ask planning staff how many times somebody has asked for a second opinion, a geotechnical report?
I can't speak for past directors, but in my tenure here since January of 2018, I've never asked for one.
What's the nature of a review, of a second opinion? Just an incompetent geotechnical engineer?
Whether or not everything was addressed, they were in serious items for anyone and not the it was neighbors.
Maybe the neighbors should be paying for the second report. I mean, I don't know if you can put that language in there.
I'm sorry, I'll piggyback onto this. When I saw that, it was more of, I don't want you to build. That was the message I got out of this. If the county doesn't want you to build, I'm gonna ask you to do another report, because I don't like what was there. I'm more of either having the complainant has a concern pay for that second opinion or removing this.
But under a type 1 procedure, how much, public involvement do you get in these? There's really no chance for public input to make a change to any of these.
So type 1 procedures can be appealed. And we post all of our development permit and geohazard permit applications are accessible online through the state Acela e-permitting website. And so we do have some areas of the county, like in the southwest coastal planning area, where we have people regularly monitoring applications that come in and asking questions about them. And so it's possible, even as a type 1, that someone could scrutinize a decision.
Is there a notification to a certain distance from the project?
Not with a type 1. So there's no advanced notification that an application has been submitted. It would be up to someone to kind of keep tabs on the e-permitting website.
Well, I would say if there was a move to remove this, request for a second opinion, that at least the property owners around would be given notification of the project, and if they were going to pay for the support, they'd know to do it at that point. Otherwise, I don't see how everybody's informed enough to know what's going on neighboring properties. They could affect them. And in regard to that, I'll say that the idea of putting the responsibility on the landowner to pick up the damages done, you know, there have been cases in the city of Astoria where somebody cut the toe off of a slide and the land began to move, and several houses in a neighborhood then were on unstable ground, and their foundations tilted and the walls tilted, and you can still see some of that in the neighborhood. And those people shouldn't have to go through that in their life. When people do a project, one thing to say that, well, they'll be responsible to pick up the damages, but that presumes they have the financial resources to pay out the settlement, which they may not. And why make people that already have established homes and other development on their property subject to damage by somebody that irresponsibly develops their property in a known hazard area? These hazard maps that we have now are general maps, and the whole idea is it's to give you a heads up. That's generally what's there based on generalized geology, generalized topography, rainfall, land cover, those kinds of things. And then, of course, you have the ability to go in there and have a detailed site review of your property that'll refine that boundary. And if it's found that that property has no hazardous aspect to it, that's not a reflection that the basic small-scale maps, the maps that look at a county-wide look, that they're wrong. They're not wrong. They're just showing it at a particular scale. And the more you drill down into those properties to smaller and smaller plots of land, the more detail you'll see. And there's obviously places within high geologic hazard zones that aren't the high hazard, just a matter of map scale. And so I think what the county has in the way of mapping is really excellent with regard to wetlands or floods or geologic hazards. But yes, when you get down to a specific lot, you need to go in there and take a look at it in detail, and you may be cleared of any the requirements for geologic hazard mitigation. But there's no other simple way of doing it. We can't map the entire county at a scale of, you know, of a few feet. And, we do have some pretty good data with LiDAR at a 2-foot level now, but, anyway, those are just some thoughts I have about what's been said thus far. And I know that, Commissioner Johnson had a couple of other points I think that you were holding off on asking, that maybe you could bring them up, unless one of the people off in the virtual world there have something they want to add. Here, you've been kind of quiet too.
I'm just waiting my turn.
Well, there's no turn. You can, in this format, let's just kind of have a free-for-all, because I can't look, you know, I'm not like a chameleon that has eyes outside my head, so go ahead.
I'll give you my thoughts so far. I think the independent review aspect, we gotta do something about that. Just because I think, as Howard said, sometimes it comes down to somebody just doesn't like a project, and it meets all the requirements, and it says in there, get your geotech review, which do, and to throw that out and make them pay for a second one, I think that if the licensed geotech says this is what's done, I mean, you've mitigated, you know. I did have a question about the overlay maps and where that data comes from, because obviously it's not super comprehensive, because if we knew exactly where the hazards were and weren't, the geotech reports would be really as important, because that tells us what's really there. So what is when we do the map overlay update, does it increase those areas, decrease those areas? What's the net change to all that?
It's a great question. So, the new data is limited to a few specific areas, and it's the Astoria area and kind of extending, a little bit to the east and a little bit to the south into unincorporated county. We have a detailed study on the east side of the county around, Westport, Taylorville, and then we have a detailed study along the coastal strip of the county. So when you look at the proposed code updates, under item 1 here up on the screen, we have those studies listed. And so those are studies that are based off of the latest LiDAR data that Dogami has done. And so as far as rating the landslide susceptibility of those areas, it's a much more fine-grained, detailed view than the current mapping that we have. And so the net change of that is some areas came out and some areas went in. I don't have a good answer as far as, you know, a percentage of land that came in or out. Probably close to a wash, but it's more specific in the location of where those highest hazard rated areas are. When I get a moment here, I will pull up the map and give you a little tour.
Is there somewhere we can before and after, or the?
You could, on Clatsop County web maps, you can turn on our current geohazard overlay.
Right, but what about the new?
And then the new layer is available in draft format. We currently have the Dogami studies listed directly on Clatsop County web maps. There's a landslide susceptibility layer, and there's a landslide inventory layer.
Okay.
And so those are essentially what the proposed new layers would consist of. We have them in a little bit more of a refined format on an internal GIS layer, and so we can look at making that available on the main web maps as a proposed GHO updates layer, so that, you know, people are able to see it and to look around and turn layers on and off to kind of compare a before and after look.
Okay.
I have a question. We started out with paper maps. find GIS data that is updated, presumably, when a geotechnical report is conducted and the data filed. County, do you then, are you required to submit that data to the state, which then uses that information on those sort of isolated areas to then make changes to the hazard layer? Do you know if there's a feedback loop that's part of that?
There's not. So when we receive a geotechnical report, it identifies what the hazards are and where they exist. But really the focus of the reports is how to mitigate those hazards for the proposed development. And so there's not any kind of map amendment that is proposed or that happens as part of that process. It's really
FEMA, where you would say, this elevation is not what you say it is.
well, even when you get a floodplain development permit, your process is you're looking at how to develop in that identified hazard area. The permitting process isn't to amend the map.
But you can make a change. I guess the point
You can
I'm
do a
making
letter
is,
of map amendment.
yeah, if you observe something that the map is not, that was, I guess, there is a process with the map. I was just asking a process. Someone comes in and says, "Oh, this whole area is totally not." It is.
We have the waiver. That's really the closest thing but again, as Commissioner Johnson mentioned, it requires an applicant to still work with a licensed professional to say, yes, this is mapped as a hazard area. However, because of A, B, C, and D, that hazard, it does not actually exist here. And so the map doesn't get changed, but we would retain that waiver on file. So we would refer to that for any future applications on the same property.
Most of these studies that are,
Yeah. Right, go
the
ahead.
geotechnical studies that are done are for a relatively small piece of property. And you can't just simply say, well, can't we extend that out a quarter mile or a half mile in all directions and say that it's all about the same? Because the landslide susceptibility can change in a matter of a few feet. You can get away from a headscarp that really makes it an entirely different picture just a short distance away. So you could put a point on a map where it's kind of been cleared, but it doesn't do that much good, really.
Reverse is also true. If the map says a property 100 feet over here is not in a geologic hazard zone,
No. I'm saying that the site-specific studies are really required when you start trying to determine whether a piece of land is likely to slide or not.
Yes.
And it could be a very cursory amount of field work to go and look and see that it's a completely different thing, that the dip of the geologic units may be in a different direction that make it more, less likely to slide, like if they dip back into the slope versus dipping out, those kind of things. So I don't see how you can get around the need to do things at two scales. One, a big general scale like we have up on our screen now, which gives a person a chance to know if they may be up against something that's going to require special engineering. And then, you know, maybe they can get with a geologist or an engineer early on and say, what do you think just walking over this property where I want to develop? You know, am I going to need a report, or can you think of that this may be an exempt piece? Anyway, those are my thoughts on that, but I want to go back to one other thing about the exemptions from needing a permit. And there actually is a list of some projects, some kinds of land development that wouldn't require a geologic permit. And that's in on page 30 of our packet under section 5.3015. Section 5 there has exemptions, and so it lists some of them. And so not every thing that you do on a property requires this kind of scrutiny. For one thing, even some of the buildings, I think outbuildings and things like that that don't require a, building permit, they're exempt, and, well, you can look at the list there, and maybe there's some things that people could suggest be added to that list that would be appropriate for exemptions, but I think an effort's been made to try to let people do things that are very unlikely to cause earth movement to go ahead without a big, expense and time sink in getting reports done.
So that's new, right? That has been added.
That's
That
correct.
wasn't in there previously, but up until this point, or even today, if you were to do anything on that property.
I understand that, and
Right.
I found it very helpful, actually, when I read through this, to read through the I think it's the first copy with the strikeout stuff rather than, maybe it's the second copy. The clean version, you know, you see what you see and you wonder what got changed. And so I went through the strikeout copy because I want to see what was added and what was deleted. And I think it's worth taking the time to do that because some of these points we're discussing, I think, are somewhat resolved in the way the text reads now. But I realize there are some other underlying things.
I have another question when I look at, item G, where it says removal of trees smaller than 8 inches. Logging is regulated by ODFW. So a lot of these properties that would still be in the geohazard overlay zone, if you were to go log your property, that's not, are we gonna get into that with this requirement?
No, Commissioner Johnson, if you look, in that same list,
Couple lines down.
Okay,
down,
there it is.
yeah, item I, forest operations which are regulated under the Forest Practices Act are all exempt.
Okay.
And that's the way it is today, too. That wouldn't change.
You know, I thought the same thing as I read through that, but I did see that item I there as well, and brings up the point that, what exactly, in the introduction, you could somehow mention which, land use zones in the county are most subject to these kind of reports, what's being done. A lot of our land is F80 or AF, and then there's the RA zones. So, with respect to all the other zones besides AF and F80, would this, these G and H, sections on removal of trees, would they apply to every other property?
Well, not all activity in the AF zone and the F80 zone is regulated under the Forest Practices Act. So, for example, if someone was building a home, had gotten a conditional use permit to build a home in the F80 or AF zone, you know, the removal of the trees may or may not be regulated under the Forest Practices Act. Some people would, you know, file a notification for clearing their building site through ODF. Other people may not. So, I mean, the other thing to consider is that, I think 80% of our county's land area is forest land, and, you know, probably pretty close to that is also currently in an identified geohazard area. So I think it would be very easy to say most of the land area that's identified as a geohazard is in a forestry use. Therefore, you know, these regulations aren't gonna apply to those activities.
Is it easy in web maps? I've been on the web map site quite a bit, so I'm kind of familiar with it. Is it easy to overlay the zones on there? If not all zones, but just limiting it to F80 and AF perhaps?
You can do that, yes. So right now I've got it showing all zones.
Mm-hmm.
And so back to Commissioner Linder's question briefly here to compare a little bit. It's a little hard to tell because the colors are so similar, but our current geohazard overlay, I'll turn that off and then back on right now so you can kind of tell which one that is. You can see in this area where my cursor is, the area that's identified as a hazard area is much smaller. But then if you were to go over here, turn this on and off again, there's quite a bit of land that's coming out of an identified hazard area. And so to look at a specific zoning designation in Web Maps, you would go to the search tools and then click on Find County Zoning, and you could check AF, F80, and then click Apply, and it will highlight everything in those zones, which is an interesting view because it's really, again, most of the land in the county is in those zones. And so what you're seeing highlighted is actually these larger areas, not the smaller ones along the roads.
Okay, yeah. That's kind of tricky. It'd be great if you could have like a hatchered overlay where it wasn't another color. You could see the colors through it.
Oh, I see. So the purple is not.
That's the part that's not. Yeah. Well, that would be an interesting map to produce in a really visual way to let people see, maybe kind of give them a little, maybe things aren't quite as grim, to be able to see how much of the county falls in the forest area that's hazardous. I did have a question kind of related to this stuff that was on page 36 of the packet. I'm looking at the lined out version. I noticed, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the mention of faults, which was under 5.30101B, that seems to have been removed. And I was wondering, is it the thought of Dogami that mapped faults aren't really a good indication of geologic hazard?
That's a good question. So I went over our current and proposed applicability section with Bill Burns at Dogami, and he did not describe faults as a recommendation to include in our new list. So I could ask that question of him just to clarify if it was missed.
Yeah, I would do that because for a single family home or something of that sort, I don't think it's quite so important, but when it comes to if you were building a school or a hospital or a firehouse, you know, I have a lot of experience with California geology, and faults are a big thing there. They have really well-mapped fault zones, and there's all kinds of scrutiny about what gets built over those for very good reason. Here, even though we have a lot of faults throughout Oregon, they don't seem to be quite as active as the ones in other places, so that could be part of the reason. But certainly for long-range planning on infrastructure, it's wise to know where those faults are and consider it for bridges and airports and things like that too. One concern I did have on the exemptions, going back to that for a minute, on page 38, section 5.30155 exemptions D, excavation which is less than 2 feet in depth or which removes less than 25 cubic yards of volume. I think that's rather arbitrary for the reason I had mentioned earlier in a discussion about landslides and how they can affect other properties. Taking 25 yards out of the toe of some landslides could be a very risky proposition for anything upslope from that. And, I mean, I'd certainly defer to Dogami's knowledge of what amount of material removed has been known to cause movement, but it's certainly conceivable that under certain circumstances, removing 25 yards could cause something to start to move. So, you know, there's kind of a balance here. I don't want to make every time you get your shovel out, you got to get a permit, but on the other hand, these details with the Earth's surface really make a difference. So that's just a comment I have on that for people to think about. And I did notice there is still this is extremely minor, there is a pronoun issue on page 32 in section 5.3030 where you have a him or his or something. And might want to change that. But I really appreciated the nice job you did of summarizing a lot of the key points in the Dogami landslide hazards document, which I've pulled off in PDF form and have tried to look through it a little bit. It's quite an impressive document. And I think it's worth noting that so much of that was based on an extensive review of what other communities, counties, and cities done around the state. And when you look at, they looked at 34 different cities or counties, and you know, there seems to be a preponderance of those subdivisions that really promote a very careful geohazard assessment. So I don't think what's being proposed here is out of line with what's done in Tillamook County or Columbia County or Warrington, the city of, or the city of Astoria. These are very consistent policies with those already been approved by political subdivisions. So I think that says a lot. I was kind of wondering though, with the survey that ran from August 5th to September 5th, and then this new document's wording is dated the 6th of September. Were you really in any way considering what was in the survey to guide what's in the final document here?
At this point, the survey responses haven't had much impact on the draft, but between what we've collected and analyzed and then today's work session and the work session with the board, we'll be incorporating all of that feedback from the questionnaire, from the Planning Commission, and from the board into the updated draft number.
Well, I thought the survey idea was great, and the questions were good on there, and it was pretty easy to go through. I also liked some of the analysis that was given about how much time people spent on it and when they filed. And I'll just say that the last one on the last day, that was me. You know, I seem to always run out of time on things, but I was heartened really by the number of people that seemed to have an interest enough to fill this out, and that there was I can't think of the exact questions, but there was an indication to me that many people in the county have actually been learning something about our geologic hazards and what to do about them. And I think we all know there's hazards out there, but there are things we can do, and that's what we're trying to figure out, how can we mitigate those hazards so we don't build a lot of stuff and then have to rebuild it later after it fails for some reason that we should have been able to see initially. So I look at this as going in a positive direction, but it's gonna be some bad. That's not meant to end the discussion with that, so does anybody else wanna pick up some point that they've been holding back on,
Yes, if I may. It's more education on the process. On back at page number 34, where it talks about certification of compliance. I noticed that was new from the old version. So I understand plan review compliance, as in the geotech has designed whatever he's going to design through his plan, he's reviewed the report, and it's in sync with what the report is. I understand that one. Then I have the inspection compliance. Well, the work has now been completed, and the professionals come back in and confirm that the work does, in fact, is complete and is in compliance. Now I go to final compliance, and this is where I get confused. I'm slow, I got a low IQ. I look at this, and I have to have a written statement from the engineer that we're in compliance. Well, I would think that would be the inspection compliance. Then I have to have another licensed engineer that is some sort of design person who says, you've mitigated everything. And then I have to have another written statement by another engineer or the same engineer that all the erosion control measures are met. And I don't know, again, I'm a neophyte. I don't even know if that's in the geotechnical. But I need to understand the process better. It looks like it's 3 steps, but I don't know why it can't be 2 steps. So just please educate me.
Sure. The simplest example that I can think of is just a construction of a home with a basement. And so the intermediate step there, the inspection compliance, would be once that basement is dug out and the subgrade for the foundation has been prepared, maybe the formworks have been put together, but the concrete hasn't been poured yet, to make sure that the ground has all been prepared correctly. And then the final compliance would be construction is essentially complete, and stormwater and erosion control measures have been installed correctly and are in working order. So once the building's actually done, oftentimes in these reports, a lot of the recommendations that we see have to do with stormwater drainage and vegetative cover or other erosion control measures after construction to protect. It's an option, right?
That's still the process for the county.
Ian, wouldn't that be just a condition of approval that you follow the recommendations of the report rather than have to get the geotech or find an engineer? You follow the recommendations as your development.
Right.
That's what's done now.
That's correct. That is how we do it now, and we also, again, provide those reports to the Building Codes Division, which does periodic and final inspections. And so this is an item that was referred to in the Dogami Guide and was also adopted in the new Tillamook County Code. So we wanted to present this to you for consideration. If there's not support for it, that's okay. And you're correct that, again, that we currently don't require these steps. So this would be something new to kind of strengthen our follow-up after we've already approved the permit and make sure everything's done correctly.
In my view, it's onerous, and it is a solution that's looking for a problem. I think that, yes, you could run into issues at some point if someone doesn't follow the recommendation of a geotechnical report, but geotechnical reports are pretty, they're to be followed. And you, as a builder, you would, incur some liability if you did not follow geotech. So you have a couple layers of protection, follow it as is. I would prefer that it would just be retained as a condition of approval rather than this process that we'd have to certify it. And again, one of the main issues that I have is, where do we find these engineers? I go find someone to come out and do this work. They aren't available. So that's a huge issue in our small little area, that we don't have professional geotechs, call on, and they can get out there in a timely manner, months and months to get a geotech.
I just got the sense the process, we just, earlier point of independent reviews required of developer if required, not the sense. Really don't want them to build. That was the message I was receiving. You really don't want to build here.
So while we're on this topic of the certification of compliance, I have a list of questions up on the screen for you, and one of them is whether the commission supports including this. And so I'm hearing, I think from Commissioner Powers and Commissioner Johnson, that you don't support this. If we could get input from the rest of you on this topic, that would help me move forward with the project and update the draft accordingly. So if we could maybe go around and everyone could give their opinion, that would be helpful to me.
Sure, I would.
I don't have any thoughts on that right now.
Does either Commissioner Pritchard or Kraushaar wish to comment on that? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I agree with once you have to get your permit and you follow the geotech's recommendations, I believe it's on the responsibility of the developer, the contractor, the homeowner, whoever it may be. And those requirements need to be followed. I'm not in favor of having a ton more inspections and more reports and more costly efforts done. I would prefer to not have it.
This is Commissioner Pritchard. I agree, pretty much what was just said. I'd like to cut some red tape, but also, they need to follow the professional's recommendation. So if that's already in place, and I miss some of it, I'm having pretty bad connection.
Thank you. As for
Connection
me,
right now,
I do
but
have one.
That's all I really have to add is.
I'm sorry if I cut you off there. It's a little bit hard.
No, you're fine. I was done.
Okay.
Just to point out that the connection on Zoom is, we're hearing not everything that's being said. It's getting cut out quite a bit. I'm not sure why, but there's a lot of pauses in between everything.
Well, it's definitely a challenge to do these hybrid meetings. And I've been on both ends of them, so I know what you're experiencing. I think if we all try to talk into our mics a little more directly, maybe that'll help. I don't know. I just had one point I wanted to mention on the final compliance issue. I was viewing that more as just a simple one-page letter that the geoprofessional would provide saying, yes, everything was done according to the plan that we had originally come up with. is it really a report that's expected there, or is it just sign off saying, yes, I looked at things and everything's right?
I would say it's the latter. Yeah, it would be a shorter, maybe a one-page document.
So I guess at this point, my feeling on it would be that, I understand the issue of, the lack of professionals locally available, or maybe even within 50 or 100 miles, and that is a big problem. But on the other hand, I guess once you've, gone ahead and had a geoprofessional involved, that this would be just a routine thing that they would add at the end. They'd come by and sign off on everything, and probably have pretty much almost a form letter that they would sign. Not that they're not treating it in a cursory manner, but that they've seen that the project did fulfill the necessity mitigation measures, and it would be no big deal. But, you know, I can be convinced, hearing more comments from others on that, to go either way. But for now, I guess I lean towards, it doesn't seem like that much of a additional requirement.
Chris, it means a day for a geologist to come down to Portland, travel down here, travel back, generate a report, and one of my experiences, these people all over for under $1,000. It's gonna get costly on there, and if we can have other ways to make sure that it's being followed, where we have the building department, they come out and inspect, and they're following your erosion control plan. And they that you're following your erosion building codes, and how to do that and come up with their own conclusion. I think that the building department, once you get out of the planning side of things, then it's on to the building side of things, and they're the ones that are watching happening as you. Building department? County building department. You guys out regularly and they should get a copy of it when we get our building permit. They review the plans to make sure that the plans are in accordance with the geotechnical and do a foundation inspection. And they're gonna also should be looking at your erosion control measures regularly on site, doing throughout the entire process.
Do you feel as planners that you're getting enough information to satisfy first requirements?
Planning staff isn't usually involved once the building inspections are happening, unless there was unpermitted work that happened and the inspector caught that and said, hey, you know, this wasn't something that was covered in the planning permit. But, you know, personally, I haven't had any back and forth dialogue with a building inspector about, you know, specific geohazard report requirements, how those are installed or implemented on site.
Are people at the county being rampant disregard for geotechnical reports? I know you don't talk to every feeling that you need these certificates of compliance because we're just not doing what the geotech is saying.
I'm not aware of any rampant disregard in the county for geotechnical report requirements.
You know, it does bring to light an interesting possibility here, is that for future work sessions and maybe for the actual hearing that comes up, I've forgotten the dates, but in October or November, we're going to be hearing this. To actually have a building inspector from the county here that could speak to that very point. You know, do they feel comfortable that they've been able to follow along and see that everything was done according to the plans? That
At
would
what,
be helpful. And
Is this certificate of compliance a recommendation from, legal counsel to
No,
up
it's
on
not.
some of the,
No, again, this comes from the Dogami Guide and was also adopted in Tillamook County's code, and it's referenced in the Dogami Guide from other jurisdictions' codes as well. So it's a tool that can be used, that is used in other places, that's referred to by Dogami as a tool of or as a component of a strong geologic hazard code. It's not required by anyone. It hasn't been recommended by legal counsel. It's here for your consideration if you think it's a good idea or not.
no, I think, I'm a huge fan of keeping options open. And, I think that generally speaking, professionals and builders and other people want to do a good job. I'm just not of the opinion that people are trying to cut a lot of corners, at least not the people that I know. Having a certificate of compliance as option in case somebody comes to town and is just like blowing and going and not following the requirements, and maybe the building staff is saying, man, this guy is, or gal is out of control. We're not seeing these recommendations being followed. That might trigger. Is that the nature of the intent of the certificate of compliance? It's just a trigger in case something doesn't look right? It's not required every single time.
As presented, it would be required for every permit.
I'd say
to
leave
me,
it
it's
on.
just
I would
more red
say
tape. It's,
sit there. If you need it, use it, but don't require it. You know?
at what point do we stop? I mean, I've built several houses, as Commissioner Johnson can attest to, as well as him building. You know, we have engineers on houses, but once they sign off on the plans, it's up to the contractor to do the right job, and the ethics is where that takes into place. There's no checks and balances. We don't have to have the engineer come back and say, yeah, he built this house exactly the way I said. It's, you know, you're supposed to do this and you do it. Now, if you are found out to not have done that, then that could be an ethics violation that's issued later on. But it's more hassle and more red tape to go through. I don't, like I said, again, I don't agree with it.
All right, so one other thing that I would just throw out there for consideration. The purpose of this code, this section of our code, is to minimize risk from hazards. And so if the Planning Commission doesn't believe that the level of risk is high enough to warrant a certification of compliance and there's not support for it, that's okay. But again, the purpose of the code is to mitigate, to minimize risk, not only on the subject property, where the development is happening, but also on the surrounding properties, because we all know geologic events don't always just impact one small site. They can have larger impacts. So if, you know, again, it's kind of out there, and same goes for the next question on the list, which is the hazard disclosure statement. That's another tool that can be used to manage risk and to make the public more aware of those risks. And you know, some of the underground implementation or mitigation measures that might be there, so people are aware and can take care of them. But again, ultimately, this section of our code is about minimizing hazards and risks to property and to life. And so, if the commission believes that, you know, these tools aren't necessary or only one or the other is appropriate, that's okay, and that's the feedback that we're looking for today to move forward.
Go ahead.
Question on the hazard, I understand. So does that go back? Father, that their home has been there for 30 years, they want to sell it.
No, this would only apply to development that is subject to the geohazard permit requirement. So if this were adopted as a new requirement, from then on, if a property owner is required to get a geohazard permit for adding on to that house that's been there for 100 years, at that point, we would require the disclosure statement. But if they hadn't changed anything and they didn't do something that triggered a permit requirement, there would be no way for us to require a hazard disclosure statement.
Can I just ask a question for clarification before we move too far on? Chair Farrar, you had asked to have a building inspector here when we reach the public hearing stage. And could you clarify, please, what it is you would like that building inspector to specifically address? Are you asking the inspector to testify that he is reviewing the plans or that people are building according to the plans? What information is it that you're seeking?
Whether they feel comfortable and qualified enough to look at the progress of the development and its final completion, and to be able to assess whether all the recommendations and requirements listed in the geologic hazard report were followed appropriately and completed properly. Whether they feel that they can handle that in as a matter of reviewing the completion of the project. Did it meet what was set out in that hazard report by the geotechnical professional? Because, you know, being a geotechnical professional and being a building code inspector are two really different things. And so I would hate to think that we were counting on some of our well-qualified and diligent staff that are in a different department, but they're not real, they know in their own heart that they're not the right one to make the decision. And I just don't know what the answer to that is. Maybe it's to them when they see one of these projects being done, that everything's being done just like the geotechnical professional said it should be, and they're okay on signing off on it. That's fine with me. But I do think somebody needs to ensure that these geotechnical measures are implemented properly, and not just write it in a report and then file it.
Thank you.
And I'll also note that here in the preparing for landslide hazards quick reference guide that I believe Senior Planner Sisson put together, notes here that 22 of the 26 codes that require geologic reports include a certification requirement of the person completing the report. So that's when Dogami looked at 34 cities and counties around the state and what they have in their comprehensive plans and in their codes. They found that out of the ones that require geologic report, 22 of 26 also required the certification. So I'm not saying we should just follow what others do, but when you see that kind of consensus among other geographical areas, and some of them with very close similarities to our own area, Tillamook, for example, Astoria, certainly, I think it says a lot for the idea of having certification. Now, whether it needs that final step C of final compliance, I'm a little flexible on that. Again, that comes down to somebody at some level saying, yeah, it was actually done right. And that's mainly, maybe not so much for the builder and the owner of the property, the ones that's paying the bills. It's, what about the neighboring properties? Don't they have an expectation that home being built above them isn't going to slide down on top of them in the middle of the night? I think they do, and I think we should be very careful about that. Many examples of literally houses coming down and hitting another neighbor's house here in Astoria, which is maybe one of the worst spots in the county for sliding. But anyway, those are my thoughts on it.
My only point of bringing this up was I didn't, B&B is fine. And review and compliance, inspection and compliance. I didn't see why we needed that third step that involved another engineer or maybe 2 or 3 engineers. I would have already been. Yeah, didn't make it clear enough, obviously, but.
Well, no, I get that, and I guess there's probably just maybe a little bit of fuzziness here amongst certainly myself, but maybe others about just what a big deal that final compliance document is. I wasn't viewing it as a report at all, but it certainly is true what Commissioner Johnson brought up, that locally it would require probably somebody using a couple days of their time to come here and just look at it and sign a basic letter and go back home and file it and all that. So, you know, that is costly, and that's a consideration.
I think the way that and maybe I'm misinterpreting this, so you think, in that last part, the final compliance and the 3 bullet points, if mitigation measures incorporate engineering solutions designed by a licensed professional engineer, so we've got the geotech that's got to certify what was done. If we have an engineered foundation, we've got someone else that has to certify what's done. Structural engineering done, we've got. I don't know the mechanics of that, but I'm going to guess if they pull up at the street and there's a completed house, they're not just going to sign off that it's good because they didn't see it from beginning to end. Is that true or not true?
Well, I'm assuming that they would have to look at it in progress at
Or they see the
steps.
reports from the county, building staff
Perhaps.
would be probably part of their report, right? They would, yes. I mean, is there a way to talk to, say, other counties that have, oceanfront land? If they have indeed adopted this, what is the nature of this and causing a problem? And I get it. Everybody wants everything.
So from my experience, what you'd have is you'd have a geotechnical report that's done. You'd have an engineered plan that follows the recommendations of. Then the building department gets a copy of the engineered plans that has both incorporated. They approve the engineered set of building plans, and they are responsible for making sure that a builder follows through their plan review process. And there are layers of case. Some of it falls on the professionals that are hired to do the.
And I totally agree. If it sounds like if it looks like everybody's doing their job, then no harm, no foul. I think that I'm reluctant to take away the opportunity to really review if there is some kind of a egregious harm being done. And that's it. All I'm saying is, and I mean, yeah, there's layers of everything, and it's.
My feeling is that it is being reviewed.
It is being reviewed, but if not, there's no harm, no foul, then you don't have to call for the compliance. I know that it's written in that it's 100%, and I don't know if we can take information and make it easier. I know that that's always harder or more restrictive, right? We can't.
This doesn't come, just to clarify, this doesn't come from a statute, so.
This is just Dogami's recommendation.
This, the certification of compliance is something that was referenced by Dogami in their planning guide as a tool of a strong geohazard code.
Yeah.
It didn't spell out exactly how that should be carried out, so there's some flexibility. This what you're seeing here in this draft format is the same as Tillamook County. And to your question, I did ask Tillamook County about this and, you know, whether it's been perceived as too onerous or too expensive or too time-consuming. They're also a remote coastal community where there probably aren't a ton of licensed geologists or certified engineering geologists there. Unfortunately, I'm still waiting to hear back from Tillamook County. But, you know, they also just recently adopted their code back in May. They may not have a ton of experience yet, if they're not really busy with geohazard permit applications.
They probably haven't had a builder or two back this up right away.
So they did say that their geohazard code, which I understand that this was a new piece of it for them when they adopted it. They said that they had a pretty extensive community engagement process and that they actually had, you know, letters of support from the public when it came to their Board of Commissioners to adopt this. So there was apparently support, broad support for what they had included in their updated code.
I have something to add.
Go ahead.
So when I buy a septic permit from the county, it includes the county actually coming out and doing inspections to make sure that I'm doing what I said I was going to do. Now, they don't come out the entire process. They come out at the very end. They really have no clue what's been put in the ground or done. They just come out and inspect it at the very end to make sure that it's done the way it was supposed to be done. They're assuming that the contractor takes all responsibility for what's in the ground and that they did what they said they were going to do. When I buy a building permit from the county or electrical permit or plumbing permit, they come out, they inspect the process before, during, and after pretty much to make sure that everything's been done. If the county's going to require a development permit and a special geo permit, then why can't the county be responsible or the planning department if they want to require this, that maybe they come out and just do an inspection to say if they're requiring it, if they know how to read the geotech reports, it's simple as, hey, I'm calling in for an inspection, come out, make sure I did what I said I was going to do. And then the county comes out and does it. I don't believe it would be the building department, because the building department, they don't have anything to do with what's outside the house. They have to do with the legal and ethical way of building a house as proposed by the plans submitted, whether they're engineered or not. But anything outside with drainage and stuff like that, then that's required by the planning department. It's a simple inspection. They can come out and inspect if they're going to require it. You buy a permit, that permit should include an inspection. And that's from listening to all this, that's kind of what I'm taking on all this, that this would be a simple solution to hold people accountable, not incur any more cost of another report or geotech or time. I mean, as we all know, that affordable housing is also a big ticket item in the county, and the more costs we incur, the more that adds up, and the more we can't comply with that. So, what are the thoughts on something like that? Holding the planning department accountable for inspecting what they're requiring to be a permit.
I have a thought on that, Jason. So if the county planning department was gonna come out and inspect that and approve that, then they're the ones that incur the liability.
Yep.
So that may be a concern for the county if they're gonna get involved in that, potentially. My 2 cents.
Furthermore, do they have adequate training to really look at the project and understand whether it was done the way the geohazard report laid out? And, you know, we could bring somebody on staff that specialized in that, but that's asking a lot from the planning department. I thought the idea of using the building department to monitor the progress of the project and to try to ensure that things were done the way it's in the report. But as I said before, I don't I don't really know firsthand whether the people in the building department feel comfortable with that, feel they are qualified to do it, and want to take responsibility for that. So I'd like to hear from them directly on that point. Maybe some of this can be done more in-house, but we shouldn't try to do it if we can't do it right.
Yeah, if the building department's doing the inspections, the county's the county. They're both taking responsibility, whether it's the planning department or the building department. County has responsibility. But it's also, I mean, if we build a house and we miss something and the building official misses it, it's also, they're not held responsible. The contractor or the homeowner or the builder or whoever it is, they're still the ones held responsible for building it per plans. If all the inspections, they all say, you know, if that they hold no risk or liability from their inspections. But I don't know if the planning department's the governing agency that requires the permit, that requires the geological report in the beginning. To me, if they're qualified enough to read those reports to require the permit, I mean, it was a simple solution to have them inspect it. But that's just a thought.
I appreciate you bringing those points up, and maybe it would be helpful at some point to actually have county council think about the issues around this and to give their opinion on where responsibility would fall if the county were to take over the process of sort of checking compliance.
Well, did you get the guidance?
So I think overall, I'm hearing there is limited or no support for the certification of compliance requirements, at least as presented. That maybe there could be a pared down version of that. But overall, I think what I'm hearing is that there is not support for the certification of compliance, and that the preference would be to rely on the community development department, whether that's the planning division or the building codes division, to inspect construction to make sure that the geotechnical report requirements have been met. So that's what I've heard. We haven't really gotten to the hazard disclosure statement, and then I also just wanted to, before we wrap up, make sure that we address any other concerns that we haven't talked about yet that weren't addressed. And then, you know, I got a little bit of feedback on the exemptions and what's included currently. So, you know, with the time that we still have, if we could just focus on the question about whether there's support for exemptions and which activities should be exempt, and then also the hazard disclosure statement. That's the feedback that I'd be looking for to move forward with the second draft.
Question on that. So, I think what we do need to come up with a better list, what potentially could be exempted, and then we could discuss that list. I'm not exactly sure what would fall in that list. I mean, we have some items that have been this draft, but I think that there are issues or other items that we talk about and decide what forward a recommendation on those items. And that on the hazard disclosure statement side of things, I'm not sure what we do now with a hazard disclosure statement. Is that something that you sign when you sign the permit? You're signing a disclosure, but are we looking at attaching something to the deed with what's proposed here on almost at the very end on page 35, item 8? It's recorded with the Clatsop County Clerk's Office.
That's correct.
So that's attached.
But I was hoping maybe we could just take one at a time and see if any of the other commissioners had something about exemptions before we move on.
So to answer that question just quickly with the hazard disclosure statement, it would be recorded with the deed, meaning it would show up with a title search when a property is being transferred.
Earlier, do the realtors have an opinion on that?
Well,
If it shows up in the Schedule B items of a title report, realtors don't even look there anyway. Maybe that's the best place to dump it all. One more item on the Schedule B. What?
Oh, ethics.
Did I say it out loud? I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll go back to my point, though. Does any other commissioner want to say something on the issue of what exemptions, whether exemptions are appropriate, and if so, they have ideas for additional ones to include or ones to delete?
I like the exemptions that were included in here, and I think that there should be some. I don't have a real strong opinion on but I definitely think
I like the idea of the mechanics of an exemption. What is, like you were talking about the arbitrary. Let's just talk about what it means to just an area that's gonna. Instead of saying you can do this, that, and the other thing, I don't know if that's even nearly as useful, because then you've got a finite list, right? But what if you said, all right, if you're gonna start removing a bunch of soil under on a certain kinds of, there's gotta be more from a geotechnical standpoint. In my opinion, makes more sense to me. Okay, you can build these things. Well, I can build a deck if I want, and I'll come in with my excavator and excavate 40 yards of material out, and, you know, now I've built my deck. It's exempt, right? You said I could build my deck as an excavation size. I think that's disingenuous, and I don't know, I'm not a geotech, and
Well, I get your point, and I agree that you can make these too detailed and too specific that really opens up some problem areas, I think. But it is nice to have, at least on this list, there's got to be some there that we could pick out. And I'm not saying we do that this afternoon, or this morning, I guess, for 6 more minutes. There are some that could be left on here as is, I think, like just grabbing one item K there, maintenance and repair of utility lines and installation of individual utility service connections. That kind of stuff, I think there should be kind of a blanket exemptions for, but some of the others might need a little, some words in there that give it a little more flexibility, either to require a permit or to allow something to go forward without a permit that may not be specifically listed here. And so I don't know how to word that stuff, but we're kind of running up on the clock here, and I'm going to just ask if either of our virtual commissioners would like to comment on the exemption aspect.
I have a comment, and it kind of ties into the exemption, but it's as far as the disclosure statement. It says all new development, which I agree, or substantial improvements, and then you have to file this hazard permit showing that your house is now in a hazard zone. So if you contract with a contractor to do a kitchen remodel and a master bedroom or bathroom that has nothing to do with your foundation, with anything, with any kind of exterior work at all, that could be classified as substantial improvement. And now you have to go through a geological report and have this filed. I'm not a fan of this. It's kind of like the city of Seaside requiring you to put sidewalks in front of your house for a kitchen remodel. If you remodel any internal part of your house, which they consider substantial, which is 35% of the square footage. I think it's 35%, that they require you to do certain things that are very costly, that squash the project in the first place. I don't think that I don't know if it goes back to exemptions or if it's part of this hazard disclosure statement, that if you're remodeling the inside of your house, that has nothing to do with adding to the geological hazard and going and having to put a permanent strike, so to speak, on your title report. Because I know when you get these title reports, I've bought and sold several houses and been a part of this. I read them, and if there's a geological hazard or a slide or something that's an automatic red flag for people, which just because these houses were already there for 100 years or 10 years or 50 years, whatever it is, and they decided to do a kitchen remodel and a bathroom, or you guys get my point, that they should have to file this and have a geological report done or geohazard report done. I don't agree with that. So if that falls under exemptions or just part of this, or we define substantial improvements, maybe substantial improvements to the exterior or to the ground or however that is. That's what I would like to see.
If I may interrupt, let's see if Planner Sisson wants to comment on what that substantial renovation includes.
Yeah, so substantial improvement means the value of the improvement exceeds 50% of the market value of the property or of the structure. So to Commissioner Kraushaar's point, you could potentially have a quote-unquote substantial improvement that didn't involve any land disturbing activities, and so it might not make sense to require a geohazard permit or a hazard disclosure statement. So that section could be, so there is a definition for substantial improvements. And so the hazard disclosure statement could be clarified or modified to state that it only applies to substantial improvements that involve land disturbing activities. So
I would
eliminate
favor that.
requirement interior only.
That sounds like a pretty good idea, but let's just take a quick, is there consensus on that from the commission?
I'd like to know what we do now for a hazard disclosure statement.
Well, wait, let's just talk about whether it would apply to a substantial renovation. So there's general consensus on that?
I don't think we, the last thing, the disclosure that gets recorded?
Well, what we were just talking about, that if there's substantial, improvements done to
Like a 50%
the property, but it
improvement.
doesn't involve the exterior, it doesn't involve breaking new ground, it's in the existing structure.
Well, I want to know what we're doing now and whether this should be something that gets recorded on the deed at all. I don't think we're recording anything on the deed right now, and we should begin to start recording things.
No, I'm just trying to take a simple piece here, because it sounded like there was consensus. It made sense that if you're not disturbing new ground around the building, putting a whole bunch of money into this house, that you shouldn't need to have a disclosure statement, because you haven't changed the effect on the land inside the wall.
I agree with Commissioner Johnson, though. Do we require this now, Ian?
We don't. So, right. So we have three big questions, which are, is there support for exemptions? And if so, which? Is there support for, and so we were just kind of talking about that one and got a little sidetracked onto the hazard disclosure issue. So we haven't really gotten to the hazard disclosure statement yet and whether there's support for that or not. So if we could maybe finish the exemption discussion, and then we could move to whether there's support for hazard disclosure statement, unless everyone said what they wanted to say about exemptions, and then we can move on and continue.
Say what you said about a 50% improvement, because I think that's a valid point. If you're gonna gut the whole interior of your house and remodel it, that's not gonna impact your geo.
Right, so we currently would not require a geohazard permit if you're doing work that does not disturb the land.
Non-soil disturbing activity.
And so that wouldn't change with this code.
So if you don't require the geohazard permit, then when the job's done, they would not have to have the hazard disclosure statement. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So it would then back to my original question is maybe that would be part of an exemption. So that's why I was trying to, we were on exemptions, and I was trying to make sure that that was part of the exemptions. Or if it wasn't, then it got removed from the disclosure statement. So
So
adding to
substantial
the
improvements
exemptions,
that don't
interior.
involve and would be exempt. Okay.
Did you have anything else you wanted to add to that, Commissioner Kraushaar?
No, I think that we answered that it would be part of the exemptions. And I'm done with the exemptions portion.
Well, thank you for your comments on that. They were helpful. Any other comments on exemptions?
I would just like to see more of a list that we could, next meeting, end it on, we could actually go through.
So we have A through M now. That's all new. So what items would you like to see added?
Well, you had mentioned that earlier that you didn't want to come up with a list because.
Oh, that, let me clarify that. That was for our survey. For our survey, we didn't show any of these A through M options. We just asked the question, should there be exemptions or not?
Right.
And
So
if so, which exemptions? So
the
today.
result of that is your list that you came up with.
So the list that we came up with, so this draft has been in the works for a couple of months. So before the survey went out, we had been working on this list. And so we've now put that together into the first draft for you to review and for you to give feedback on. We have not collected public input on A through M. We've just asked the general question, should certain activities be exempt, and if so, which ones? And so those results are in the packet, and I believe are all covered in A through M also. So we do have a list for you to go line by line to look at, to discuss today. And again, we're coming to you with a second draft in November in a public hearing looking for your recommendations. So today would be kind of your opportunity to go through this list.
Okay.
I like A through M. Kinds of very light, hard to press to cover. The only thing I don't really understand, well, it says forest operations sub. I don't understand G and H. So, the canopy thing, I'm just gonna assume.
I have one question related to that tree issue. In item H there, removal of trees larger than 8 inches, provided the canopy area of the trees that are removed in any 1 year period is less than 25%. Well, that means in 4 years, the 100% could be removed. Where did that idea of spanning it out over a number of years come from? Would there be a look to see if, well, they've removed 50% now and there's still no problem, and we just going incrementally until the land starts saturating and moving, or?
No, that's a good question. Most of these recommendations are pulled from Tillamook County's recently adopted code, so I could ask that of them as well, how they came up with the time frame, because that's a good point.
Yeah, I think in part it would depend on whether you wanted to allow a whole bunch of tree removal. If it's a steep slope, that might not be a good idea because roots are really major in holding land masses together, and they also, larger trees consume a lot of water from the soil, which desaturates the soil. And so it's a tricky question to try to do in a one-liner like that. And I don't know if you could make it more general and flexible, that you'd need to base it on the particular piece of property or what, but,
Yeah, what if you're 25%, you remove on 25% slope? Right,
yeah.
and then bam.
So it's kind of like that slide that happened out on Highway 30 here east of town. That was, cutting that vegetation up so close to a steep cliff was not really the greatest idea, but it happened.
And just to be clear, we don't currently have any tree removal ordinances, even in geohazard areas. Someone could do that today and
Yeah.
wouldn't require any kind of permit.
I don't know whether you've looked at the city of Astoria's plan, but, they're very cognizant of the importance of the trees. And some trees, you can cut them off, you know, the top off of, say, a maple or something, and the root system's still there, and it'll start drawing a lot more water out as it regrows. So sometimes there's ways, you know, being very flexible on how much vegetation can be removed without disturbing the soil moisture.
A comment, I think it's a real slippery slope when we get into tree removal on rural Clatsop County. I mean, the cities are different, and when we're talking about rural Clatsop County and what people can do with tree removal on property, then where do you start with it? 25% in a yearly period, there's, you know, I don't think we should get into that. There's other regulations if people want to buy off their property. And it's a solution looking problem. This isn't something trying to get something in our code that's not there currently, and it really hasn't. That issue that you're talking about on Highway 30, I believe that would have been regulated under enforcement. So that would have been exempt.
Well, I agree, but it's
It's still a problem. It does, what I'm saying is
so
that.
if you take
the
that
rules-
land and put it in a
the
different zone, I'm just saying that's
the
an
rules
example.
don't- Just because you have rules in place doesn't necessarily mitigate any problems that you may or may.
We're just trying to do a reasonable job.
So anyways, that's my thoughts of the day. That's my thought on that.
Okay, well, those, G and H are, you know, well, G, I guess, doesn't have any conflict, but H is kind of a tricky one. You might flag that as, let's think about that one because it's complicated. There's probably others on there that have that same attribute of being a little bit complicated, but,
Then, you know, D with the excavation, like we've talked about before, with 2 feet in depth, that's an arbitrary number. 25 cubic yards for 2 feet of depth, those are just, I guess it comes from Dogami, and they've got some reasoning.
So let me ask you a question. Do you believe that excavation should be exempt to some extent, or should all because currently any excavation is going to require a geohazard permit. So, do you support exempting
Post holes
any?
for, fence, post holes for, deck?
Under that reasoning, there should be some exemption, reasonable.
Right. So that's what
Where you're
this
headed.
would do, would exempt anything less than 2 feet. But if you have a number that you think makes more sense,
by excavation, you mean that's removal, or is that just digging that deep maybe to do something and then you're backfilling it?
I mean, I think excavation would be the act of removing
Permanently.
soil from the ground.
But-
I don't know that it implies what happens after.
Because I could see somebody digging a pit for some reason, and as part of their project, but they're gonna refill it. They have to get down there to do something, to put in a valve or something.
I think it would be the act of disturbing the land would be the excavation. So whether or not it gets backfilled, it would still be considered an excavation once
Well-
the land is removed.
Well, I'd be less concerned about excavation that was temporary as long as it was done in a less wet season environment. that kind of thing, but, we're kind of running up against the clock here, being 10 minutes over, so, I think maybe, I don't know if there's a way we could submit comments to you directly in email, or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why don't we do that? If somebody looks at the list, between now and the next couple of weeks and sees something that's really glaring, they could just, email to Planner Sisson, and we could move on to the disclosure. Senior planner. What S is there?
I think I'm okay to move forward. I think that there was not support for the hazard disclosure statement. That was kind of the last item on the list.
That's where I'm at. Here.
Well, just to be clear, I'm the odd man out here, but I think the disclosure statement is fair and reasonable, and, I think having it in there helps to move people towards doing their projects responsibly. They can say, yes, there is a hazard there, but look what we did to mitigate it, and here's the proof of it. We actually have a certification that shows it was done right. It all kind of folds together in a process, but, when you pull a piece out, you know, things can fall apart like a house of cards. So I would be still prone towards the certification without maybe the additional formal gold seal on some final report. And I would be for a disclosure statement, letting people know what they're getting into, the development. And are there anybody else at the virtual side of the screen here, or do you want to comment on that, either commissioner there? Guess not. Any other comments here?
I already have, sorry, I'm not in favor of it.
Okay, your sound wasn't real clear on that, but, can you make your comment again?
This is Commissioner Crosser. Again, I'm not in favor of putting a big red dot on properties and having that labeled on there.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Linder, do you?
I agree.
Tend to boards, we don't understand.
That in our public meeting, we're gonna wanna be
Yeah,
prepared
I don't understand.
We've already jumped through the hoop of ramifications with what's on title reports.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, if you really wanted to look at these things, pretty brutal. I don't think most people understand, and I've seen people make decisions without being fully guided by professionals, and they've been unable to do the things that they wanted to do because point out to them those things. It's in my chaw, and it's just a hill that I'm going to die on, right?
That's a grim description.
Grim.
I wonder if I could request from either Senior Planner Sisson or from Director Hendrickson the schedule again for, there'll be a work session with the county commissioners on
October 5th.
October 5th, and then our public hearing is after that,
November 8th.
November 8th.
I've got the dates back up on the screen for you for reference.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so I would just encourage all of us on the planning commission to kind of review what we went over today and think about what people maybe with a conflicting view had to say. And, because this is a work session, I think we had a lot of good discussion. And I think we have differences of opinion, but we're all listening to one another. And I think most people made their point in a way where, it was understood what their concern was about. And, it's important to try to think of ways we can come together and resolve some of these issues. And they're very important for our economy and other factors. So it's a big responsibility, and I just encourage everybody to be really well prepared for November 8th, but also, if possible, to tune in to the Board of Commissioners work session and listen to how, what their back and forth is. And, I think with the time at 15 minutes past our end time, I will just ask if, Senior Planner Sisson has any final thing to give to us.
I do not. Thank you all very much for the discussion. That will definitely help me move forward. So, yeah, I appreciate your time discussing that with me today.
Well, we appreciate your fine initial report and your ability to answer our questions so well and to engage us in keeping our work session productive here. So thank you very much for that. And I'll just ask if, Director Henriksen wants to briefly go over the status report.
There's not much to comment on the status report. We do have first public hearing for the comprehensive plan update and the community plans scheduled for tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. And so I would encourage everyone to attend that. It's virtual or in person, and it would be here in this meeting. The Zoom link is on the agenda package on the county's website.
Thank you for that. And any final thoughts from any commissioner here?
Just, we have some guests in the audience. Anything you wanted to speak on, or?
Thank you very much. Okay, without further ado then, I move we adjourn the meeting at 12:20. Maybe they need to start a program here at the college or the schools to get more geotechnical people. Yeah. Yeah, right.
Almost every building permit we have now requires.
So how do I get out?
Very, very.
In